Hey there folks, Andrew Swan here, and today I'm going to look at various motion interpolation options in AVISynth. Now, first of all, I'm not a fan of motion interpolation in general. I especially hate what modern TVs do when they're interpolating 24 frames per second content up to like 60 or 120 or 240 or whatever frames per second. It looks really nasty and unnatural to me. But motion interpolation is used in a lot of different workflows, and some of them are particularly useful. Things like QTGMC, which uses motion interpolation to create full frame detail from half-height fields in interlaced video. But you can also use it to do things like slow motion when you have just a regular speed shot, or if you want to do a frame rate conversion from, say, like PAL to NTSC or vice versa. What I'm going to be looking at today is actually a number of different workflows using a few different AVISynth plugins as well as a paid alternative. And I'm including that in there for those of you who might be considering this for sort of a pro workflow. So you can see sort of the trade-offs and benefits versus the other options that are out there. But before we do that, I should give my standard disclaimer, which is I take no responsibility for anything that happens to you or your system as a result of following this tutorial, because it's your system, not mine, and there are other factors outside my control, such as malware authors that try to inject code into open source projects and stuff like that. So just in general, if you are working on a system where you cannot have any instability or virus infections or stuff like that, I would generally recommend going with a paid option instead of something like the AVISynth FFmpeg workflow. So take that for what it's worth. Also, I have a blog, macealatthefront.blogspot.com, and I put up posts of the tutorials right around the same time that I put out video versions. I generally consider the blog posts the sort of authoritative versions of the tutorials, because I can make small changes, updates, corrections, whatever, without having to redo the whole video. So the blog post for today's tutorial will be linked to in the video description notes down below as well. So if you want to just go straight there, you can find it down in that area. And one other thing, because this is already going to take a very long time to get through because of all the various little quirks involved in motion interpolation, I am not going to explain how to set up AVISynth, FFmpeg, and AVSPmod, as well as installing a lot of the plugins and such. If you have not done that already, I will throw a couple of video versions of those tutorials in the recommended videos right about now. Just pick one and go with it, either the sort of 32-bit only tutorial or the 32 and 64-bit side-by-side version. Either one works. I do the side-by-side on my system because I test a lot of stuff, and sometimes the 64-bit version is better. Today's case, in fact, there is a plugin that works significantly better in 64-bit, but not all plugins are 64-bit native in AVISynth, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, all that being said, let's get started. So first of all, if you are working on a professional project and you want something that will essentially just work, quote unquote, you should probably look at Twixtor. Guys at Revision Effects are not paying me to endorse them or anything like that. I've tried it out a few times and it does what it says. I'll be including Twixtor in the comparisons today because I think it's important to see how these plugins stack up against a sort of professional standard. And the other thing is, Twixtor, as I mentioned, is a plugin, which means you'll need to use it with Premiere Pro, After Effects, Final Cut Pro, or a handful of other programs. Okay. All right. Now, for AVISynth, assuming you have AVISynth, FFmpeg, and AVSPmod already installed, if you go on down to the external filters page on the AVISynth wiki and go down to adjustment filters, frame rate conversion, you will find all of the different plugins that can do frame rate conversions. Now, the reason why it's organized under this is that motion interpolation is something that can optionally be applied to a frame rate conversion process. So the plugins in this case that would do motion interpolation are technically geared towards frame rate conversion. And that's actually kind of what I'm going to focus on today. Now, there's a number of plugins on here that are essentially single process plugins, like convert 60i to 24p or VFR to CFR, and those serve very specific narrow purposes. They're not great as sort of a general purpose frame rate conversion / motion interpolation solution. There are actually only 3 plugins that I would recommend out of this page for that purpose. Those being Frame Rate Converter, Interframe, and YFRC. Each has their own advantages and downsides, although one of them I think is kind of the clear overall winner in my opinion. But the cool thing here is that you'll get to see as part of this the 2 major ways in which motion interpolation is performed, and I'll get into that in a bit as soon as we have everything set up. Speaking of which, Frame Rate Converter requires MV tools and mass tools, and also the FFTW3 library, which you can find if you go to www.ffTW.org/install/windows.html. MV Tools 2, Mass Tools 2, and FFTW3 are all prerequisites of Qtgmc. So if you already have Qtgmc installed, then you're most of the way there. The only thing you have to watch out for is that, unlike Qtgmc, if you want to use the 64-bit version of Frame Rate Converter, you need to install the 64-bit version of the FFTW3 library in your System32 directory, which is the kind of the opposite of what Qtgmc asks for, which is for both the 32 and 64-bit versions, you have to install the 32-bit version of FFTW3 in your syswow64 directory. So I will just show you what that means briefly as I go in and download and install this. All right, so obviously, if you don't have MV tools or mass tools installed already, then you'll need to click on those links and go and grab the latest version. But for Frame Rate Converter, when you click on the plugin link here, that will take you to the project's GitHub page, and you can just click on the releases link there and grab whatever the latest version is. Frame Rate Converter does have pretty much the most options out of these plugins, and the documentation is not particularly straightforward. However, as it turns out, most of the defaults are fine to just leave as is, and I'll show you the ones that you can adjust aside from that make the real difference. All right. Interframe, on the other hand, actually has everything that's needed included in the plugin download, which is nice. So if you click on the script link here and click on the download now button, it'll just download it. What it requires is a plugin called SVP, And as it mentions here, it includes that in the download package. So pretty cool. And then finally, just as kind of an aside, because there is one aspect of this plugin that actually works better than these other two, but otherwise I wouldn't recommend it over them, is YFRC, the Yushko frame rate converter. If you click on the script link there, you will see that actually it is just a .avsi file. So actually the best way to grab this is to click on the YFRC title there and then just right click and do a save link as. It too requires Mass Tools 2 and MV Tools, but that's it. It doesn't need the libfftw3 library installed, at least as far as I know. I could be wrong though, because I had that set up before I tried messing with it. And again, it's got a much smaller list of options here. I'll get to that in a bit. All right. So once you've downloaded everything, go ahead and fire up your antivirus solution of choice. Go ahead and go to your downloads directory and scan everything. Yeah. And once you've done that, let's get started installing this stuff very briefly, because we still have a lot of stuff to cover in this tutorial. So if you followed my tutorials about how to install Qt-GMC, you've already set up the 32-bit version of FFTW3. So this is kind of just a review, but basically, I'm going to open up a new window, go to your Windows directory, and go down to System32. Keep that up. Then go to your Downloads directory, open up FFTW3, and what we're going to actually be dragging out is this libfftw3f-3.dll file. So drag out a copy of that, right-click, rename, and rename it to fftw3.dll, just like that. Scroll down to the files in System32, drop it in, confirm the administrator privilege command, and then drag out another copy of the same file, libfftw3f-3.dll, and move that over as well. And if that seems odd, it definitely is, but that's the way that you set up the FFTW3 library, in this case for 64-bit usage. Okay, once you've installed that, then you can go into wherever your AVISynth plugins folder is. If you've used the installer, then you'll probably have it listed in your start menu under the AVISynth Plus or AVISynth menu item. In my case, because I use the universal AVISynth installer, I have this AVISynth repository directory with all these different versions of AVISynth set up in separate folders here, and I'm currently using the x86 and x64 versions of AVISynth Plus. I'm going to open up the framerate converter archive, and you'll notice here that there's framerateconverter.dll and framerateconverter-x64.dll. You can probably guess this, but the x64 version will go in the x64 or 64-bit version of AVISynth or AVISynth Plus in the plugins directory. And I think you can guess where framerate converter without the x64 goes. It's in the 32-bit version. Okay. For interframe, you'll notice that it's a .avsi file. So that's just essentially a script that references other plugins. And once again, you can drop it into the plugins directory. And it unfortunately will only work in the 32-bit version of AVISynth or AVISynth Plus. You'll also need to install what's in this dependencies folder if you don't already have SVB Flow installed. Basically just drag over these two DLL files and you're good to go. All right. And then for YFRC, again, because it's a .avsi file, you can just throw it into your plugins directory. It does support 64-bit, so you can put that same script in your 64-bit plugins folder if you do have that available. So that concludes the installation process. Now let's take a look at these different options in a script. So again, I won't be covering how to create an AVISynth script here, but let's just open this up in AVSPmod. And let's take a look at a really basic command here. Because I'm using AVISynth Plus, I'm going to start with a set filter MT mode and then put frame rate converter in quotes, a comma, and 2. So that frame rate converter is working in multi-threaded mode 2. Then FFmpeg source 2 to load up the video file, which in this case will be a commercial for a local restaurant that I did a number of years ago. Load up that file name in quotes, a comma, and then a track equals -1, because in this case it needs that in order to properly detect the audio track. The -1 means it'll load up the first audio track that it detects in the file. Then after that, frame rate converter, preset equals slow. And the reason for just having this relatively simple command here is that all I want frame rate converter to do in this case is to take a 29.97 frames per second video file and convert the frame rate to 59.94 frames per second, otherwise known as a 30 to 60 frames per second conversion, and interpolate the frames. And that's all I need to tell it to do so, because by default, frame rate converter will automatically double the frame rate of whatever you put into it. And then again, because this is AVISynth Plus, I have to do this prefetch command down at the bottom, which is based on the number of logical processors in my system minus a couple so that you can have a little overhead. All right. So let's go ahead and just position the cursor somewhere in here and take a quick look at what this is going to look like. All right, let's go back a little bit here. Yeah, you'll notice that it's a little bit slow to load each frame. And that's because it's doing some pretty extensive work here. All right, let's see if I can just keep scrolling through it. There we go. Okay. So if we, first of all, you'll notice that this is working if you get your correct frame size and then this 59.94 frames per second counter down here. And in this case, because I'm coming from a ProRes file, it's YUV422P10 color space, otherwise known as 10-bit 422 chroma subsampling. And that's going to become an issue in a bit, but for frame rate converter, it can handle pretty much most of the common video color space formats natively. Now, as I advance through this frame by frame, you'll notice that this wipe here is getting this kind of blended edge every other frame. If you look really closely, it's not a perfectly straight line. and that's as a result of it doing this sort of combination of frame blending and motion interpolation. The thing to know about frame rate converter, however, is that it's not a particularly quick to render plugin. I've done extensive render testing on it with the different presets and some of the other options. The range of speed presets go from slowest, slower, slow, normal, fast, faster, fastest. So the main thing that happens when you switch from 32 to 64-bit in this case is that render times get more consistent, as well as being faster overall. So the preset that I generally use the most, which is slow, in the case of the 64-bit version, it varied between 8.7 to 8.6 frames per second. For 32-bit, I got everything between 3.3 and 7.2 frames per second. And that increases like beyond exponentially when you go to slower and slowest as presets. So for example, for the 64-bit version, the slower preset rendered at about 3.8 frames per second. The 32-bit version of the slower preset rendered at 0.62 frames per second, for a total rendering time difference of 9 minutes and 34 seconds for the 64-bit version, 57 minutes and 59 seconds for the 32-bit version. Then when you get down to the slowest preset, you move from 31 minutes and 12 seconds for the 64-bit version to 2 hours and 54 minutes estimated for the 32-bit version. I quit out of it because I wasn't going to wait 3 hours for just a simple test render. And that's true across the board. In fact, there is a similarly large jump on the opposite side when you get up to fast and faster presets. For fast, the render time ranged between 6 minutes and 10 seconds to 4 minutes and 10 seconds for the 32-bit version. For the 64-bit version, 1 minute and 45 seconds. So basically, if you're going to use frame rate converter, use the 64-bit version. It's faster, more stable, better all around. It will use more memory, especially if you get into slow or below. It will use approximately double the amount of memory. In my case, about 5.5 gigs of RAM versus 2.9 gigs of RAM. But anyway. So now that we've looked at that, let's briefly look at interframe. So you'll notice the command's a bit different here. I'm still loading up interframe into set filter MT mode and setting the mode to 2. But you'll notice that in this case I'm using Qt input rather than FFmpeg source to load up the video file. This is something you only need to do if the source video that you're working with is 10-bit or higher in terms of color depth. For whatever reason, if you try to use FFmpeg source to load a 10-bit video file into interframe, what you'll get is the blended frames will show up. Half the screen is green. Or other weird stuff like that. So it just really doesn't like it. And even using this convert to YV12 color space command after the FFmpeg source command doesn't fix it. So you have to use a different input method, again, if it's a 10-bit video. If it's 8-bit color depth, you're fine. You can just use FFmpeg source, and you don't need to put in the convert to YV12 unless you've got some weird different chroma subsampling that you're using. Okay. So I've loaded up the video file here using Qt input, then done convert to YV12 because Interframe will only work with video in the YV12 color space, and then loaded up Interframe. Now, Interframe is a weird one in the sense that the best quality / slowest preset is actually named medium. And then it goes up to like fast and faster, I think. There's really no reason to use anything other than medium as a preset because, as it turns out, Interframe is significantly faster than frame rate converter. There's a couple other settings that you do want to pay attention to. The cores setting you want to set because otherwise Interframe will throw up an error. Basically, it's the number of logical processors that you're dedicating to the process here. I generally put it to the same number as my prefetch command here. You can experiment if that doesn't work for you. GPU equals true or false. I honestly, in practice, haven't noticed a massive difference with this setting. Supposedly what it's geared to do is actually to keep around the same render speed when it's enabled, but to perform a more detailed analysis. In practice, I haven't noticed enough of a difference to really warrant it per se, but I figure why not keep it on? Unless you have a GPU that essentially is pokey potato quality or whatever, you should be fine just leaving it on, and it might give you a very slight boost in quality. However, this tuning option has a significant impact on the way that the image looks, because essentially you're switching between priorities in how Interframe works. And to explain how that is, let me just go to a particular frame here. All right, so let's actually roll back a bit here. So as I move through frame by frame, you will notice that every other frame here is kind of blended again, but it's maybe a little more kind of mushy around the edges. This gets to be more visible when we go a bit further here. And we'll take a look at this horse coming into frame. You'll notice that it's doing nice, clean, discrete frames around the horse's head up here. If you look down here, watch the leg when it comes in a second here. Yeah, it's kind of tweaking out a bit, but as it becomes a more distinct thing, looks reasonably good. Now again, you're seeing this in motion when you're actually watching it, so you won't notice the artifacts quite as much, but they are still very much there. Anyway, let's take a look at the difference between this, which is the smooth tuning option, and the other one, which is weak. You'll notice there's some others here as well, but I'll get to that in a sec. Okay, so using the weak preset, what it does is it prioritizes image detail over smoothness of motion. So it tries harder to sort of keep objects together while they're in motion. It's interesting, and it's kind of a debate as to which one you would really want to use. And for that, in a moment, I'm actually going to go in and take a look at some renders that I've done with these various plugins, just to kind of show you what that looks like. So anyway, those are the major options that you need to pay attention to with Interframe. There's something else that is going to come into play for both Interframe and frame rate converter in a sec, but first, let's very briefly bring out our YFRC script here. And take a look at this. Yeah, that's all good. Right. So you'll notice that even though this is loaded up using FFmpeg source, and there is no convert to YV12 here, it's showing up as YUV420p10. So it's 10-bit 420 color space. Yeah, YFRC is a bit weird. Also, it will only frame double, and you'll see that this becomes an issue in a bit, but for now it's fine. You'll notice that there are these block H and block V. These are short for horizontal and vertical block sizes. This is an important distinction that you have to set depending on the size of the video that you're importing. And if we go and look at YFRC's documentation, you'll notice here that there are 3 different settings for this. And you set both of them to the same. I don't know why they have separate listings for it, but there you go. So you set it to 8 for 320 by 240, 16 for 720 by 576, or 480. It looks like this was geared towards PAL originally. And then 32 for the high definition frame sizes. Since we're doing 1920 by 1080 with this video, we're going to be setting both of these to 32. Then for overlay type, this will change the frame rate conversion method. If you set it to 1, it tries to do frame rate conversion without blending frames. And the end result of that, if I can get to, again, a little bit before this wipe here. There we go. 1 frame, 2 frame, 1 frame, 2 frame, 1 frame, 2 frame. So what it's actually doing is just kind of doubling the number of frames, and then occasionally it will work on smoothing image detail a bit. It's not particularly great, but what it does do is it works really hard to have clean frames whenever possible. If you switch it to overlay type 0, on the other hand, then what you'll get are blended frames. And these are just straight up blended frames. So why would you want to use something like this over frame rate converter or interframe? As you'll see in a bit, both of those ultimately have, I would argue, better image quality. Well, look at this. When we get to the transition between shots, just a moment here. Okay, catch that? All right. And just to double check, let's do that with overlay type 1 as well. Yeah, nice clean division. Okay, now let's take a look at that in interframe. Let's get to there. Oh, yep. Did you catch it? Yeah. Now, interframe won't do this for every cut that you have, but because these are programs that try to interpolate between frames, the program freaks out a little bit, doesn't quite know what to do here. In theory, it should be using something known as scene detection to prevent that from happening. In practice, it kind of does it. So if we check out the difference between here, so in this case, for example, it detected it just fine and there's no weird distortion. but between these frames, it kind of messes up. Now, it's actually not the worst of these that you can find in motion interpolation processes, though. So, as I will show in a bit here. By comparison, if you go and do this in frame rate converter, let's get to close to this frame as possible here. Because again, I'm on the slow preset. All right, let's back it up. Yeah, what you get is just more of a blended frame whenever you have a cut. All right. Now, to demonstrate this a bit more clearly, including showing this in motion, because trying to sort of display all this stuff in real time is kind of taxing on the system, I've pre-rendered out a bunch of different files here. So just to kind of show you what we're working with to begin with, here is the original commercial.
In Madrid, New Mexico is a place called The Holler. Wherever you come from, however you get there, you'll love the Southern comfort food from Chef Josh Novak. Ahi tuna, caprese salad, and beautiful burgers. Wow! Fried chicken with grits, and delicious chocolate cake. The Holler Restaurant. Fabulous eating for any appetite. Southern comfort food done right.
Okay, so there's my little plug for the commercial, and I will mute the audio for the rest of this. Just to sort of show you why I'm resorting to these incredibly elaborate workflows, let's take a look at this when you're doing a frame rate conversion using Premiere Pro. If you just use the built-in frame sampling option, for example, this is what you get. So if I slow down here, it looks okay at first until then you do start skipping through, and you'll notice that every 2 frames, a new frame is generated, which means basically that it's just duplicating frames. So it's not really interpolating anything. Then there's frame blending. And check this out. What that does is blend every other frame. Just straight up blend. No processing algorithms whatsoever. Yeah, it's pretty gross. Then there's optical flow. Now, optical flow at first glance looks okay. Well, actually, maybe not at first glance even. Doesn't really know what to do with dissolves. That's sort of strike one. Then when we get into here, the edges are a little rough, but not horrible. Yeah, did you catch that? Okay, so if you thought the frame rate converter and interframe blended frames between cuts are ugly, optical flow has a really nasty one. In fact, if you look closely, what you will see, if we zoom in a bit here, is that not only is it ugly, it's rendering out its interpolation at like half the resolution of the video. So at first, it looks okay when this horse comes up, until you kind of see Yeah, if you look down here, yeah, half resolution. So if you are absolutely desperate and only have Premiere Pro available and can't install anything else, then this can kind of work. In motion, not everybody will notice. What you'd really want to do with this, honestly, is if you're going to use it, you'd apply it to an actual Premiere Pro sequence before it's rendered out, so that you wouldn't have the frames in between the cuts being processed. But let's compare that to frame rate converter. Here's frame rate converter in motion. So for those of you who are on watching this on mobile and like 30 frames per second, you really have to watch this at 60 to get a sense of what the actual motion is like and playing back, but it's pretty darn smooth for the most part. Now you will notice some weird glitchiness from time to time. Some of this is because Premiere is not always the smoothest playback program, but let's take a look at some of these various places again. So once again over here, we're getting a sort of mostly frame blended effect. And again, when we get to that cut, there's, blended frame between them. But during the action, even though it is frame blended a bit, it still looks pretty smooth. And if we look at the horse here, you notice that there's a little bit of extra kind of blending around the nose and such, or sort of around the edges of moving objects, but at the same time, things don't break up as much. So the trade-off that you get here is that frame rate converter will make for cleaner individual frames that doesn't break up with kind of that interpolation artifacts, but it will essentially look like frame blending with a bit of interpolation applied. So that's the trade-off. And you can see it most clearly here. So the plate of food comes down and every other frame has this kind of almost onion skinning effect on it. All right. Some people are okay with this. Other people, it bugs the crap out of them. So let's take a look now at interframe using the week preset. And actually, this is a really good place to look at it, but let's start with a horse. So the horse, again, is really a good indicator of what it's going to look like. So as you see, there's less of sort of this wide-ranging frame blending. There's still a little bit of an edge around it. But you will still get these occasional little artifacts on the edges that kind of twitch and move around or whatever. All right. However, in motion, looks a bit better. Now again, some frames will, because it's interframe, some frames will have that sort of weird between cuts frame. All right, but let's look at this plate of food as it's coming down. As opposed to frame rate converter, pretty much every frame here, even though it's got a little edge of kind of these artifacts, especially, like here and here, you can kind of see the kind of warbled effect there. It works really hard to try and keep the image detail together and does a reasonably good job of it. You'll see it a little bit more clearly when you're looking at the hand here. Hand moves forward, twists around. Because the hand moves and changes shape so quickly, it's something that's really tough for any interpolation program to deal with. Now, do you see that? All right, let's do that again. This plate comes in much faster, so you can get a better sense of what the artifacts actually look like. You can kind of see around here that there's these kind of warbly whatever edges every other frame. But it's trying really hard to hold on to all the detail in the motion, and each frame looks like a distinct frame of motion. All right, there's one other place that's worth looking at here. And that's this. Pretty much all motion interpolation algorithms have a little bit of a trouble dealing with dissolves, but it's kind of something you more feel rather than see in motion. I can kind of show you here. Yeah, it takes a sec sometimes to stabilize the playback. There we go. Yeah, so it's not terrible. Interframe does a pretty good job with this. If we go back to frame rate converter, what you'll notice is that up here, this little part up here for some reason twitches out, and over there a bit as well. I think it's because it's freaking out at this particular pattern of detail here. So again, depending on what's in your video, it may not be a suitable solution. All right, so I've done all that, but there's one other thing that I think I should really show. All right, so let's just, for the heck of it, let's throw on YFRC and go through a bit of this as well. I promise for these other things I'm going to show you in a bit, I'm not going to be nearly this detailed, but so this is type 1, which doesn't really blend frames, and as a result can look a bit choppier, but it's definitely not the worst thing in the world. I mean, it does a reasonable job at kind of maintaining a bit of a interpolated feel. Yeah, you can kind of see there that it kind of mushes a bit, and do you see how it kind of, you have this thing where like elements of the background are running at one frame rate and then other elements are kind of twitching a bit. So that's kind of the major disadvantage of using this, is it's kind of susceptible to that with overlay type 1. If we go to overlay type 0 and try and mess around with this a bit, that's a bit better. Let's take a look at the horse again. But it does more really obvious frame blending. So you have all of the disadvantages of that. It almost gives it kind of a slightly blurry feel. Yep. And if we scroll back here, but again, the advantage here is that you don't get that same kind of freak out happening on different parts of the image in the same way. Although it's still maybe got a little bit of that there. Anyway, as I said, I personally wouldn't necessarily use YFRC in most cases, but if you are working with a pre-rendered video like this and the frames that are generated between cuts bug you, then YFRC is the only one of the bunch here that's really kind of detected the scene changes properly and not created an interpolated frame it cuts. So there is still one other thing that I want to show you, however, and that's Twixtor. Now, keep in mind, this is the demo version, so it's going to have a big old watermark on the image or whatever, but check it out. Let's actually back that up and bring it forward again. Yep. So you'll get those little freakouts because it does interpolate between cuts, and it's got a really nasty one as well, as you can see here. But when you get over to here, check this out. So pay attention, keep watching. You'll notice that there's no freaking out over on this side or on this side. Everything looks like it's all moving at the same frame rate. There's no shimmering up above here. All right, so Twixtor is not perfect. Let me show you where it sort of falls down a bit, at least with default settings. So let's take a look and go back to the horse. Horse is actually pretty good. At first, clean, super clean frames. Then when it gets in, you'll kind of notice a little bit of an edge around moving objects. It probably was hidden a bit because up here, this is against a blown out sky. Get the leg coming in, and it has sort of this halfway between the frame blended and optical flow sort of look. You'll kind of see that it kind of warbles the edges around this moving object a bit more than some of the other plugins, but it's pretty clean. What it will have in some cases is sort of a larger area of distortion around the moving objects, but the distortion field will be cleaner than the one that's present in Interframe, for example. And that's kind of what you get in general. So when we look at the plate of food coming down here, you will see that it is really clean. But if you look real closely right here, you'll see that it kind of extends out a bit, this sort of shimmer field here, into our yuppie shirt here. And kind of pokes out a bit further. Let's watch the hand as it comes up here. And you can kind of see it there, that it pushes in. But where you'll really see it is here. So look at the every other frame as this plate of food comes in. You see all that around there? Yeah. It's fairly aggressive at doing that, but as you can see, it also works really hard to try to kind of blend it into the rest of the video. So if you frame by frame like this, then it's pretty noticeable, but in motion, it tends to be a lot smoother. Anyway, so that's the difference between those. All right, so if you need to take a break now to stretch or something like that, go ahead. I'm not going to be nearly as detailed with the next couple of workflows I show you, but if you don't want to just do a frame double, if you want to actually convert something from a frame rate that doesn't cleanly divide into another frame rate, so for example 24 frames per second to 60, then you get some different issues that show up. So If you want to do that in frame rate converter, then you have to load up the script file here. And let's take a look at this. So I've got a piece of 24 frames per second content here. This is actually DSLR footage from a short film I did a while back called The Old Man and the Tailypo. It's up on my channel. I'm going to throw it up in the recommended videos right about now. All right. So I'm going to load this up and then run it through frame rate converter with preset equals slow. Frame double equals false because we don't want to frame double this. This is going from 24 to 60. So if we were to do frame double equals true, it would change it to 48 frames per second. All right. Then the way that you have to show the frame rate in frame rate converter, and interestingly enough, this is also true in interframe, is to do new num, new den, which is short for new numerator and new denominator. That's right, you have to do division in order to create a non-standard frame rate. Now, this is actually the same way that FFmpeg derives frame rates as well. So it's pretty close to the same terminology. So if you already know what that is for FFmpeg, then you can just translate it over to here. In this case, numerator is the number on top, denominator is the number on the bottom of a division. So in this case, we're taking 60,000 and dividing it by 1001, which gives us 59.94. Okay, so if we load that up, and we can kind of just roll through this a bit. Looks pretty good at first. And then as this moves forward quickly, you'll start to see some kind of, again, artifacts around the edge. And, you know, it's going to get worse, though, when you see it in motion. Trust me on this. But that's basically how you do this in frame rate converter. For interframe, I just comment out the previous and load this up. Since I'm coming from an 8-bit video file, I don't need to do the convert to YV12, and I can actually use FFmpeg source 2, which is nice. You'll notice that interframe here settings are pretty much the same. Difference is that I've changed the tuning to film. That's for working with material that is shot at 24 or 23.976, in this case, frames per second. So if we load that up and start rolling through it, again, looks okay, looks okay. Starting to break up a bit there. Yeah. Got a little bit of that, and we'll see that more in detail in a sec here, but that's how you set this up in interframe. And the difference between film and smooth versus weak or whatever is not quite as distinctive here. So, all right, YFRC you can't do it with because YFRC only frame doubles. Let's check that out in motion here. Move over to a new project. So here's the original clip. It's going to look a little bit jerky because the sequence is actually running at 60 frames per second versus 24. And this is a 24 frames per second, or technically 23.976 frames per second clip. But I chose this because it's a really difficult clip for motion estimation algorithms to work with, because the camera's moving, it's handheld, and there's moving objects going often in different directions within the same frame. All right, frame rate converter. Looks okay for a bit. Oh, yeah, look at that. So once again, you have this same phenomenon where the background appears to be running at a smooth 60 frames per second, but this foreground object is kind of breaking up and being choppy. In addition to the barrel of the rifle getting kind of broken up. Oh, yep, and you get an overall kind of distortion here. And yeah, there's a lot of shimmering going on here. So pretty nasty. Considering that frame rate converter generally does mostly frame blending, that's kind of amazing that it's that broken up. But let's take a look at enter frame. So enter frame at first looks really nice. Then when he walks forwards, yeah, there's still a little bit of that hitching and twisting and whatever. It's a little bit better, but it's still, you'll get these kind of all this distortion around the edges of moving objects. All right. Now, to be fair, I could have chosen an easier clip for these plugins to deal with, but I really wanted to show off the differences clearly here, and I think this really does it. Now let's take a look at Twixtor. So Twixtor again looks great at first, and then all of a sudden you've got this trail of ghosts. And when you go to the left-hand side, the sort of really wide area of the, I assume, the sort of motion vector detection or whatever, kind of freaks out and kind of pulls over to the side of the frame. So you get less of the kind of almost sawtooth squiggling that you get around the edges of the moving object. But in return, you have larger patches of distortion. Even if the patches of distortion are technically smoother and less noticeable in some cases. Yeah. So the answer to this basically is that this is the reason why I don't recommend going from 24 to 60 frames per second, whatever method you use, because there are always going to be cases where it's just going to look like ass. All right. Still, there is one other use for motion interpolation, though, that I think is worth looking at. And that, if I bring back up frame rate converter here, is doing a frame rate conversion from a higher frame rate to a lower frame rate. And this is kind of an interesting one. It's the sort of thing that normally you would have to use very expensive hardware conversion or software services in order to deal with properly. Off the top of my head, I think the Terranex from Blackmagic is designed to do this reasonably well, and there's a local company out of New Mexico called Cinefilm that has a service called Tachyon that does frame rate conversion like this. I don't know how much Tachyon costs, but it's one of those call us to set up an appointment things. Whereas the Terranex, I think, is $1,200 to $1,500 or something like that. Just for the conversion box. You still have to have all the cabling, the video output, cards, and some sort of recording device that you plug into in the other end, yada, yada, yada. So, all right. Let's take a look at this. So, as before, we're loading up the video file, and then loading up frame rate converter, preset equals slow, frame double equals false. Except in this case, because we're going to the NTSC variant of 24 frames per second, we're going to be doing a numerator of 24,000 and a denominator of 1,001, which results in 23.976 frames per second. Okay, let's load that up. And because this is frame rate converter, it's going to be a little on the slow side. All right, and kind of skip through a bit. So you can see that it still has that blended frame between cuts, but not too bad overall. Okay. All right, now let's take a look at that with interframe. Surprisingly enough, the commands are very similar. So, interesting thing, if you don't specify a numerator and a denominator for interframe, it will assume the frame rate that you want to convert it to based on the frame rate of your input video. If it's 25 frames per second, then it will try to double it to 50. If it's 30 frames per second, it will try to double it to 60. If it's any other frame rate, it will try to convert it to 59.94 frames per second. Interesting. All right, so once again, because I'm loading up a 10-bit video file, I have to use Qt input for a QuickTime file, then convert to YV12 color space, then do interframe with all the standard settings here, but we're going to use a numerator of 24,000 and a denominator of 1,001, which results in 23.976 frames per second. All right, and if we take a look at this, got the same sort of blended frames for the wipe. Oh, a little hitching there. Yeah, it's not present in the actual converted video, but looks pretty decent. It's a little wobbly, but it works. All right, so let's take a look at what this would look like in motion. All right, let's start with interframe. So again, you're getting the blended frames between cuts. So that is the disadvantage of this. But overall, it's not doing too bad. All right, in fact, if we sort of scrub back through here and go to the different places, horse is coming through. Yeah, you're getting some distortion on the edges there, but pretty decent. And the plate of food coming down, it's got a little bit of ghosting on it. You can kind of see there. But there's actually not as much sort of distortion around the moving objects, except in shots like this. And yeah, there's some. It's not bad. All right, let's take a look at frame rate converter. So once again, using those same mostly frame blended edges. Yep, and we got the horse coming in here, where again, you're getting that more frame blended look. The plate of food coming down has got some frame blended looking frames here. That kind of, again, onion skinning look. but essentially no distortion around the edges. And let's see. Unfortunately, there is some distortion up here in the eaves or whatever. So, not perfect. And just to clarify, that distortion is not present in the interframe render. Okay. That's using interframe smooth. You know, pretty much would be my first choice for this type of conversion. All right, now let's take a look at what Twixtor does. So if we look at the horse again, a lot cleaner edges up there. There's still some distortion on the leg, but overall, I would say better. Let's see what the hair toss looks like. Yeah, there's a little bit of distortion on individual frames, but again, not nearly as bad as interframe. And when the plate of food's coming down, there's no sort of onion skinning. So a little bit of distortion around the hand as it comes up here. And likewise, when the plate of food comes down, you'll see again that kind of wider area of distortion around the plate. And if we look over here, no distortion up in the eaves. Aside from some judder as a result of the change in frame rate, looks fine. But again, it's going to have those really ugly frames between cuts. So if you're going to do this, apply it on the original project. But overall, it does a pretty good job. All right, so just for completion's sake, as long as you've been watching this far, let's take a look at what Premiere does by default. Here's optical flow. Once again, you get that nasty artifact at the beginning there. And yeah, it's about the same. You get the twitchy frames in between. And you get the interpolation done at essentially this half resolution sort of thing. That being said, if you look at the plate of food here, it's actually reasonably clean. As the hand comes up, you can kind of see more of the distortion along the edges there. And if we look at this plate of food, again, if you frame by frame it, it's pretty ugly looking, but in motion, it's okay. If you do frame blending, my advice to you is don't look at that. Yeah, horrifying is what I would describe frame blending. Frame sampling, what will happen is that same thing where you'll go a couple of frames and then you'll have this sudden jump, couple of frames, and then this sudden jump. That. And it creates this kind of herky-jerky mess. And nausea-inducing at the end there on that pan. And just for anybody who's curious at the end, if you were thinking, oh wow, why don't I just try FFmpeg's built-in method? Why don't I just go straight to the end and show you? It's got that same judder. Because it's doing essentially the same thing. It's dropping frames as necessary, rather than trying to interpolate. All right, so grand conclusions. Overall, I'd say if you have the cash to throw down, Twixtor will be your best bet if you can do it at the project stage, like while you're still editing something. If you have to do it on a pre-rendered video, then if it's mostly a single shot, you should be fine with either frame rate converter or interframe. They both do a decent job. I'd say interframe smooth would be my pick for most cases, just because it has a better sort of overall feel of motion and doesn't do any frame blending. If you absolutely positively have to work with a piece of pre-rendered content with a bunch of cuts in it, and you don't want to have those nasty little blended frames between cuts, then pretty much your only real option is YFRC. And as you've seen, it has some significant downsides in the fact that you can't change the frame rate that it converts to. It will only double whatever you're working with. I would say using overlay type equals 0 would be my preference, although overlay type equals 1 may be more your preference depending on how much detail you want to get out of each frame. But it is not a perfect alternative by any means. So, if you're interested in some of the other plugins up here, MSU FRC does a great job if you're working with standard definition video. It can only work with base 16 block sizes, which means you can only use 720 by 480 or 720 by 576 video. So that's NTSC or PAL standard definition. Frame double up here only does straight frame doubling, does so via blending frames, and does not use multi-threading. And it has the same issue as interframe in that 10-bit video, you have to use a different input plugin other than FFmpeg source, or you'll get weird visual glitches. Motion is ancient, has confusing documentation, is not multi-threaded. In fact, if you try to multi-thread it, it will slow it down significantly, and produces nasty-looking artifacts. Oh. So, there we go. This is probably going to take me a week to edit. But for those of you who've stuck around till the end, congratulations. I tried to make this super comprehensive because, as you can see, there isn't one perfect solution to every workflow. And I think you really need to understand that before jumping in and trying to use these plugins. As always, if I've made some sort of a glaring mistake, left something out, whatever, please leave it in the comments down below. If you have any constructive criticism as well, you can put it down there. Although if you say this video was too long, I will say, no kidding. This video is about a month overdue at least. And it's because it took so damn long to work on all the different combinations of this stuff. If I find out enough additional information, I may do a follow-up video in the future, but otherwise I will probably move on to much simpler topics after this for my next video. If you really enjoyed this video, you like the kind of insane level of detail I went into here, then please give it a thumbs up. Maybe consider subscribing to my channel. If you really liked it, you can go to my blog, and there's a link to my Patreon page there. And you can toss me $1 or a few bucks for every tutorial video. I do it on a per video basis because, at least at this point, I don't do more than about a video a month. Even if I suddenly did this as closer to like my full-time work, I probably couldn't do more than about 2 at a time because of the amount of time it takes to research and produce these videos. as soon as I start getting patrons, what I will do is I'll start posting up early versions of videos that I'm working on, or maybe even blog posts, and just ask you guys for input so you can sort of contribute to making this channel and the accompanying blog a better source of information overall. Or you can just watch stuff early and be like, wow, that was cool. Anyway, you can donate $1, you can donate $10, whatever you feel like doing is fine by me. This is just extra money to try to help me make ends meet. I'm not expecting to get rich off of this, but any support is appreciated. Aside from that, all I can say is, until next time, happy video editing.